It's a balmy summer evening when Therese Johannessen looks out her window on the sixth floor of her apartment complex. After a moment, she hears the familiar sound of the door that leads to the stairwell slam shut beneath her by the ground floor, and it's soon followed by the quick paces of young children echoing around the buildings as they're eager to join their friends. Therese's daughters, Therese and Elena, appear down on the road. They almost look like small dots from their mother's perspective. It has started to rain, but the girls wanted to keep playing for a bit with the other kids in the area, so they dropped by to grab some umbrellas just a short while ago. When they cross the road, they briefly turn around and wave back up at their mother, who has no qualms about letting her children play by themselves in this family-friendly suburb. This is the 80s, and it's normal to let kids run around on their own. But tragically, Therese has no idea that this may be the last time she will ever lay eyes on one of the girls. Today I will explore a story that in Norway has been known for many years as the Therese Case. Many years after it first unfolded, some people compared it to the perhaps more widely known Madeleine McCann case from 2007, when a British child disappeared while on holiday with her family in Portugal. Both stories include a young girl who goes missing with seemingly no clues explaining what really happened. And as has been the case in the story of Madeleine McCann, the Therese case has also spurred theories for decades on who is responsible for the unbearable heartbreak inflicted on the loved ones left behind. But as you will soon learn, today's episode is also the story of another person, a Swedish man named Sture Bergwall, whose life would end up being interlinked with the unsolved case. When I started to research the Therese case, it was soon clear that telling her story wouldn't be possible without also exploring the life of this man, who between 1994 and 2001 was convicted of a staggering 8 murders, and eventually made himself known as one of the first serial killers in Scandinavia. But before I get started, I want to say thank you. I started this channel only a couple of months ago, and I'm happy to see that more than 200 people have already enjoyed my videos so much that they have chosen to subscribe. I hope to make that number at least 500 by the end of the summer, so if you like today's episode, please consider subscribing. It's really the easiest way to support us, and I would be very, very grateful. Let's get on with today's story. Nine-year-old Therese was often described as a girly girl who liked to dress up and play with her friends. She was seen as fairly responsible for her age, and whenever her mother let her roam the area unsupervised, she would never go anywhere without first informing her of her plans. People also said she was always a bit shy, and because of this, it seemed highly unlikely that she would ever willingly talk to anyone on the street that she didn't already know. The area of Drammen in Norway, where she lived with her mother and her sister, was a suburb called Fjell. There were a lot of social housing projects in the area, and the demographics largely reflected this. Fjell had a significant number of immigrants and refugees, but also families such as the Johannessen family, with a single parent working hard to make ends meet. The case starts on July 3rd, 1988. It's a Sunday, and during the evening, Therese had taken her 2 daughters to see their grandparents, who lived in an apartment complex only a short walk away. They had dinner with them, after which they returned to their home. But this was in the summertime, and the sun would still be up for hours, so the girls had wanted to go play with their friends in the area. Therese had no objections to this. When the girls left, she went to have a cup of coffee with some neighbors in the building. It's not hard to imagine the mother sitting in a chair soaking up the last bit of sunlight while feeling her tummy with a smile. You see, she was 4 months pregnant with a child that would eventually be Therese and Elena's little sister. But at some point, Therese decides that she needs to go start a load of laundry. Their building has laundry facilities in the basement, so she heads down there to start the machine, after which she returns to their apartment. The person she is seeing at the time is a man named Jesus, and I apologize, I am not sure of his ethnicity. It could be that his name is pronounced Jesus or Jesus, but since I'm not certain, I will stick to pronouncing it as Jesus. Either way, he is sitting on the couch when Therese comes in, relaxing by himself watching the television. And it's around this time that the first drops of rain start to fall outside. Soon after, their intercom buzzes. This is the girls, Therese and Elena, and when they return to the apartment, they tell their mother they want to play some more, but because of the rain, they need their umbrellas. The girls grab them, then quickly head back down the stairs. and as they reach the street level, they soon join 3 of their friends across the road. Only a short time later though, 6-year-old Elena returns. She wants to go to the nearby candy shop to buy some treats. Inger-Lise is confused why her older sister Therese is not with her, but Elena tells her that she went to play with their friend Annette. Annette's family lives only a couple of floors above them in the same building, so Inger-Lise is not troubled by this. She gives her youngest child some cash, then closes the door behind her. But then it starts to get late, and Therese fails to return home. Time goes by and it starts to get dark. 6-year-old Elena has already been back at their apartment for a while, so eventually Inger-Lise figures she needs to go look for her oldest child. But first she also remembers that her laundry is still in the basement, so she decides to go grab it first. This is around 8:40 p.m. She quickly gets in the elevator, but on her way down she makes an observation that puzzles her. Therese's bicycle is inside the entryway of the building. This was odd. Therese never took the bike inside, and she would also make sure to lock it, which it hadn't been. And next to it on the ground is the umbrella that she had grabbed from their apartment earlier. This immediately rubs Inger-Lise in the wrong way, so she quickly puts away the clothes she has just hauled up from the basement and goes to see Annette's parents a couple of floors above. And this is when the situation suddenly starts to get more serious. Therese is not with them. In fact, Annette has not seen her all day. Inger-Lise quickly heads outside and she starts to look around the area for her daughter. She begins to shout Therese's name, and soon the sound of her frail voice starts to echo around the apartment complex. She buzzes the intercom and asks Jesus up in the apartment if Therese has returned while she has been away, but he tells her no, and soon he comes down to join her in the search. They start to drive around the suburb. Jesus is driving while the distressed mother screams her daughter's name out the open window. But after a while, it becomes clear they need help. So around 10 p.m., they finally call the police. A more organized search begins. People from the Red Cross join in, and eventually a helicopter scours the surrounding parkland. Therese had been wearing a white t-shirt, a denim skirt, striped socks, and gray shoes. But while this description of her is circulated, the cops fail to find any traces of her. Wells and drains around the area are closely inspected to see if the girl has fallen into any of them, and the authorities knock on every door in the 13-story tall apartment complex at Lauritz Hervisvej number 74, where the small family lives. They force their way into any locked room they find in the building, and after several days of scouring every inch of the suburb, there simply just remains no signs of Therese. The child has vanished into thin air. Now, I mentioned before that the younger daughter, Elena, had gone to buy candy at a candy shop. When the girl who works there is interviewed by the police, they do learn of an interesting observation. This girl actually remembers Therese and her friends buying ice cream earlier that day, but later Therese would return on her own, and this time she was there to buy candy for herself. But what stands out to the girl behind the counter is that the 9-year-old has 39 Norwegian kroner with her. That's not too much money these days, but back then that was a lot more cash than the parents in the area would normally give to their kids to buy treats with. When Therese leaves the shop, the worker goes outside to smoke, so she sees the young girl as she walks away, but Therese doesn't cross the bridge that leads back to her building. Instead, she takes the road that goes under it. And this puzzles the girl who worked at the shop, because as far as she knew, most kids in the area are scared of going that way. In fact, they have given it the nickname Skumlevejen, which roughly translates as the scary road. Why did Therese choose to go this way? What was her business underneath the overpass? Is it possible that someone was waiting there for her? Maybe someone who had given her the money for the candy? Whatever the answer is, this was determined to be the last time anyone saw the young girl. This is the point at which the authorities are forced to consider foul play, and it soon becomes a suspected kidnapping case. When they look at their registry of people who have been formally convicted of crimes that may suggest they would be able to harm a small girl, the cops generate a list of 150 local individuals who are all considered possible suspects over the next couple of days. Now, while this doesn't lead to much, they soon appear to catch a break. A young man who lives in the same building as the Johannessen family, while he's on leave from the military, reports that he saw a young girl matching Therese's description on the day she disappeared. She had been outside the entryway of the apartment complex, and there had been a man with her. From his description, an artist manages to compile a sketch of this person who had been accompanying the small child. And this man becomes known as the man with the scar, and soon other people confirm this observation. Some even claim that they overheard parts of the conversation that the man had with Therese. Supposedly he had tried to persuade her to go with him, and he had told her that her mother knew about it and approved. Shockingly, this had been around 8:20 p.m., so little more than 20 minutes before Inger-Lise Johannessen had gone out to look around the area for her daughter. It's easy to feel like sometimes that life is a series of coincidences, and it's really hard to not consider if this story had turned out very differently had Therese's mother left her apartment just a short time earlier. The man with the scar would eventually be the most solid lead that the cops had to go on, and when they circulated the description of the man in the media, they were eagerly ready to answer the phones and talk to anyone who possibly knew who this person could be. But unfortunately, their efforts didn't result in the influx of new tips that they had hoped for, and to this day, the man with the scar remains unidentified. Another tip that materialized over the next couple of days was the fact that several people observed a red Volvo cruising the area around the building, and a number of locals had found the behavior of the driver suspicious. But with no actual description of the person behind the wheel, it was hard for the cops to pursue this lead, and no one had managed to take note of the license plate either. If someone had actually seen the driver, perhaps this description could have been compared to the sketch of the person seen talking to Therese outside the apartment complex. But with so little information to go on, this is yet another lead that hasn't led to much over the ensuing years. When the investigation started to stagnate, the distressed mother was at one point hospitalized. She was given sedatives to help her deal with the trauma, but anytime she would take a nap, she would simply wake up and the horrifying reality would remain unchanged. Often her first question would be if they had found Therese while she had been asleep, but every time, the answer would be no. And that's when the rumors started. Some locals suggested that Inger-Lise's partner Jesus was responsible. But when Therese disappeared, Jesus had simply been at home in front of the TV watching football. And the truth is, he had been just as devastated as her mother. Another rumor claimed that Therese could have been taken by a Pakistani man, whom Inger-Lise had dated before she met Jesus. Some believed that this person had in fact been Therese's biological father, and it was suggested that his family had taken Therese with them to Pakistan. In part, this belief had materialized after someone had reportedly seen a girl matching Therese's description in the Copenhagen airport a couple of days after she had disappeared, and she had been in the company of a number of individuals that had looked Middle Eastern. Apparently, the cops did eventually send a delegation to an unnamed small town in Pakistan to investigate this lead. And while it seems that a lot of people have focused on this theory over the years, it has simply never been substantiated by any proof. On December 6, 1988, Tine Johannessen is born. Remember, Inger-Lise had been pregnant when Therese disappeared, and she had been forced to carry out the final months of her pregnancy during the initial search for her oldest daughter. She would soon seek comfort in caring for her young infant. The family moved in with the grandparents for a year or so. Living in the same home where she had lived with Therese was understandably too hard for Inger-Lise, and eventually she relocated to another unit in the same complex. She had saved all of Therese's clothes, but it got to the point one day that even if Therese returned, they wouldn't fit her anymore. After 3 years or so, the bike which Inger-Lise had discovered unlocked inside the entryway of their building began to rust, and finally one day, she realized it was time to let go. While she kept Therese's school bag and a couple of other treasured belongings, Inger-Lise discarded most of her wardrobe. This didn't mean she was prepared to give up all hope that her girl would one day find her way home, so when she and the girls moved to their new apartment, Inger-Lise had a new sign made for their front door. A sign that read the names of the family members: Inger-Lise, Therese, Elena, and Tine. This more or less sums up the heartbreaking story of Therese Johannessen. What's perhaps most distressing is the fact that no real conclusion has ever been offered, and to this day the case still looms like a dark shadow over the tall grey apartment buildings in Fjell. But Therese's story didn't end in 1988, because one day the case would suddenly enter a new chapter. 10 years after Therese walked away from her family's apartment and was last seen taking the path that the kids in the area called the Scary Road, a 48-year-old man in a prison in Sweden would make a horrifying confession that finally seemed to offer some answers. Sture Bergwall was born on April 26, 1950. He grew up in the small town of Korsnäs with his 6 siblings. His parents were deeply religious, and most of their spare time was spent with the congregation at the nearby Pentecostal church. Sture was a scrawny and pale kid, and at one point he had to live at a sanatorium until he got better. This meant, however, that he was found unfit to attend a regular school, so overall, his childhood was marked by a lot of hardship. But none of this excuses the fact that when Sture was a young man, he would go on to sexually abuse at least 4 small boys, and he was subsequently diagnosed as a pedophile and sentenced to confinement at a facility for mentally ill offenders. This is when Sture was forced to commit to therapy, and it seemed to work for him at first, because a couple of years later, the authorities decided to give him another shot at a normal life. Sture was released and rejoined society, but his freedom was short-lived. He quickly found himself addicted to drugs, and at the age of 40, while unemployed and struggling to make ends meet, Sture tried to rob a bank. And immediately, he was reincarcerated at the Sæter psychiatric facility. Sture had suffered neglect his whole life, which is likely what had chased him into a life that was held together by pills. When he got back to Sæter, he quickly found himself addicted to the medications they were giving him, and he slowly became eager for the doctors to increase his prescription. This is when Sture, seemingly blinded by a need to physically repress the many challenges within his mind, made a remark to a nurse one day. "What if I told you I had done something really bad?" he asked her. They had been on an excursion to a beach that day, but when they returned to the psychiatric facility, the nurse had mentioned Sture's comment to one of the psychiatrists. Immediately, the doctors at Sæter decided to explore the patient's memory more closely. His medications were indeed expanded upon, and soon he was regularly given an intense cocktail of diazepam and rohypnol. The therapists focused on exploring Sture's repressed memories of his childhood in order to see if they may explain some of the behavior he would exhibit later in life. And it didn't take long before the man was able to recall instances from his early years when his parents would abuse him. Suddenly, Sture was vividly telling the doctors stories about how he was raped by his father when he was only 4 years old, and that his parents horrifyingly at one point forced him to eat parts of his dead brother's corpse. These details went far beyond what the psychiatrists at Sæter could have ever imagined would transpire from his therapy. Eventually, Sture Bergwall also decided to change his name as a way of coping with his past and try to put some of these terrifying memories behind him. And that's when he took the name Thomas Quick. Quick was his mother's maiden name. Sture, or now Thomas as I will refer to him, had initially gotten what he wanted: more medication. The only issue was the doctors weren't done with him. They were eager to intensify his therapy after they had been successful at making him talk about his past. But let's pause for a moment. Why am I telling you all of this? And what does any of this have to do with Therese Johannessen? Well, it was soon clear to Thomas that if he wanted the doctors to keep him on this substantial amount of medications, he needed to give them more of a reason. And soon he started to tell them about some of his darkest secrets that had been hiding in his mind. Horrifyingly, they were memories of killing people. In several instances, Thomas was able to provide a staggering amount of detail about murders he had committed before he was admitted to Sæter. But no one could have foreseen the extent of the crimes he would admit to. Over the next decade, Thomas would go on to confess to over 30 murders across Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And suddenly, Thomas Quick wasn't simply a mentally ill pedophile anymore. He was a murderer and a cannibal, and he would eventually be widely regarded as the first serial killer in the Nordic countries. Now, you have probably guessed where this is headed. One day, many years after Therese Johannessen had last been seen, Thomas Quick would go on to confess to her murder as well. He claimed he had taken the girl to an area near the town of Mysen in eastern Norway, where he had discarded her remains in a pond. When the cops went and drained the pond, they found what they believed to be bone fragments of a young child. And when the case went to trial, Thomas's testimony, paired with these forensic findings, was sufficient to convict him of the murder. From 1994 to 2001, Thomas Quick would be sentenced to 8 murders, all by unanimous juries. In chronological order of the crimes, these victims were Charles Selmanovitz in 1976, Johan Asplund in 1980, Trine Jensen in 1981, a couple with the last name Stiggehus in 1984, Gry Storvik in 1985, Jenon Levi in 1988, and finally Therese Johannessen in 1988. These murders were all prominent cases that have been widely reported on around Scandinavia over the years. And during his trials, the prosecutors would recount what Thomas had been telling his therapists during his treatment. A common theme behind his many horrifying crimes was the level of brutality with which these murders had been committed, and it seemed as if even Thomas's defense attorney believed the man to be guilty. Now, there were some journalists and legal experts that felt Thomas was possibly making up these stories, and that his confessions were false. He was indeed able to inform the court of many details from the individual crime scenes, and he was also able to vividly recount how he had sexually assaulted several of the victims before killing them. But at the same time, not a single piece of forensic evidence actually linked him to any of the killings. Regardless, Thomas Quick was convicted of all 8 murders, and he was sentenced to an indefinite prison term. His life story would later be widely debated in the Swedish press, but after he received his final conviction in 2001, Thomas eventually decided to isolate himself and stop speaking to both journalists and his family. And he also changed his name back to his birth name, Sture Bergwall. With the conclusion of these convictions, you may think it finally offered the loved ones who had been left behind an opportunity to find some form of closure to these heartbreaking cases. For decades they had been left with no answers as to what had really befallen these victims, but now they were finally able to move on with their lives. There was just one problem. Thomas, or Sture, had made it all up, and over the next couple of years, this scandal of how a highly sick man could be wrongly convicted of multiple homicides would start to unravel. Before I go on with this episode, I want to clarify that the stories of these 8 victims are all equally tragic, and each one of these people deserve their own episode. Today I will only focus on Therese Johannessen, but don't think it's because I find her story more important to tell than the others. Hopefully I will be able to explore these other stories over time, in which case you will likely hear more about Thomas Quick or Sture Bergwall as well. Hennes Rostam was a Swedish journalist. Hennes had for years produced documentaries on issues related to societal neglect, and he had for a while been interested in the stories of Sture Bergwall's confessions. He was puzzled by the fact that it had remained so polarizing over the years. After all, Sture had been unanimously convicted of several horrifying crimes, so why were some people not convinced that he was guilty? Hennes decided that the country needed to hear the killer's own explanation in order to provide some form of resolution to the emotional debate that would still sometimes appear in the media. This was in 2008. It had been 7 years since Sture Bergwall had last spoken with anyone from the media, but after he wrote to Sture and the convicted murderer agreed to meet with him, Hennes went to visit him in prison. Little did he know, however, that these meetings would turn out very differently from what he had expected. The third time they met in person, the alleged serial killer suddenly broke down crying, and finally he admitted the truth, that he had made it all up in order to gain access to more medication. Every confession, every admission, every memory, they had all been lies. "I am tired of living a lie," Sture had emotionally exclaimed. "I wish to set this right for my family, for the families of the victims, and for myself. I never killed anyone. I made it all up." Over the next couple of months, Sture Bergwall would go on to explain more about what happened back when he first started to admit to the murders. The staff at the Säter psychiatric facility had seemed overly eager to learn more about these crimes, and they had seemingly believed in every word Sture had said without questioning their validity. They knew he was a sick person. After all, there was indeed a reason why he was placed in one of the nation's most prominent facilities for the criminally ill. Yet somewhere along the way, they had failed to properly evaluate whether or not Sture was actually telling the truth. In his own words, Sture had felt pressures into telling them more and more stories of his supposed past as an active serial killer, and as mentioned, he eventually confessed to more than 30 murders. He gained an almost elevated status among the patients, and it's been reported he was more or less given unrestricted access to psychiatric medications, which is what he had been wanting the whole time. But this also meant that his mental health started to severely deteriorate, as he soon began to develop alternate personalities and suffer from severe anxiety attacks. There are videos of Sture reconstructing the murders in which he is clearly hallucinogenic from the drugs in his body. His speech is slurred, and his attorney has to physically support him in order for him to simply stand on his feet. One of his many confessions would lead to the apparent solving of an 18-year-old murder, which had been considered unsolvable. And in another session, Sture provided information on a murder in the town of Växjö in 1964. This murder from 1964 was, however, outside of the statute of limitations in Sweden at the time. But because of Sture's admission, the case was considered closed. Oftentimes during these sessions, the details he gave would be wildly erroneous. but Sture would rely on the reactions of his therapists to guess the answers expected of him. He also began to research more cold cases on his own. Whenever he was granted day release, he would visit the Royal Library in Stockholm, where he would study microfilm archives and learn facts about unsolved murders that he would later claim to be responsible for. This is how he eventually ended up confessing to the murder of Therese Johannessen. Sture had requested back copies of the Norwegian papers that had originally reported the case, and these provided information that hadn't been mentioned in the Swedish media. That means that Sture suddenly knew of several details regarding Therese Johannessen that were unknown to the Swedish authorities. So when he provided these during a session, it led them to believe that he may actually be responsible for whatever happened to the girl. Sture would eventually go on trial for her murder, and as mentioned, pivotal to his conviction were the bone fragments uncovered in the spot where he claimed to have gotten rid of the body. Later, however, when the truth behind Sture's false confessions began to emerge, another forensic examination of these bones would finally be made, and the authorities were stunned to discover that they were in fact not bones. They were wood chips. The fact that this wasn't determined prior to the first trial for Therese's murder was obviously later heavily criticized. These so-called human remains had been material in his conviction, and without them the whole trial would have only relied on Sture's own testimony. When the authorities went back and scrutinized the transcripts from Sture's many therapy sessions, it was obvious that his initial attempts at providing answers to questions related to murder weapons and crime scenes were often completely wrong. But in the end, these erroneous guesses would be edited out of the testimonies that were then presented in court. Sture's therapists would explain this approach by claiming that posing leading questions was part of the process of unearthing the patient's repressed memories. And in relation to Therese Johannessen's case, a psychologist stated that traumatic events are retained in the memory, but there can be protective mechanisms that work in the unconscious to repress their recall. That's why it had been normal for the therapist to sort of notch his mind along by helping him put together his explanations. Hannes Rostam's documentary kickstarted a scandal in the Swedish media when it successfully uncovered the complete manipulation of a mentally ill person over the course of many years. The police had seen Sture Bergwall, or Thomas Quick, as the solution to solving dozens of cold cases, but in their quest to provide closure to the families of these victims, they had failed to adhere to basic principles of legal discovery, and the Swedish Minister of Justice had to publicly defend the work that had been carried out by the authorities. In 2009, Sture's counsel convinced the Svea Court of Appeals to retry several of his convictions, and in 2010, it was time to take another look at Therese's case. His attorneys asserted that Sture in fact had an alibi for the day she disappeared, and combined with the revelation that the supposed bone fragments had actually been wood chips, it led to Sture's formal acquittal when the prosecutors voluntarily dropped the charges. In 2013, Sture was inevitably acquitted of the last of the 8 murders he had previously been convicted of. Many years after first being confined there due to sordid actions in his youth, he was finally released from the Säter psychiatric facility. And while most of his medical treatment has been made confidential for obvious privacy concerns, it's apparent at this point that Sture has not been on any medications for several years. Today, the story of Sture Bergwall, or Thomas Quick as he was called at the time of his trials, is considered the largest miscarriage of justice in Swedish history. One of the targets of the criticism and outrage has been famed psychologist Margit Norell, who had been a supervisor at Säter around the time of Sture's therapy. Margit was very much a believer in the fact that repressed memory could indeed be reproduced through cognitive therapy. This approach had been popularized in the United States in the 1980s, and it had formed the basis for expert testimony in several criminal cases in Sweden during the 90s. But subsequently, author Dan Josefsson has claimed that Margit had been the leader of, and I quote, a cult-like group of psychologists who had manipulated the cops and talked Sture into making his false confessions. I don't want to be the judge of this claim personally because frankly I know very little about forensic psychology, but at the end of the day, Sture Bergwall's therapy did indeed unquestionably lead to a man being wrongfully convicted of crimes that he had nothing to do with. Sture Bergwall's acquittals during the early 2010s would eventually provide another terrible realization. With all these cases considered closed, the authorities had done little work on the homicides in the years that had passed. So when it's determined in March 2011 that Sture did indeed not kill Therese Johannessen, Therese's mother, Inger-lise, suddenly has to come to terms with the fact that for the last 13 years, no one has been pursuing the real answer as to who's responsible for her daughter's disappearance. The reality is, Inger-lise has never actually believed that Sture Bergwall's confession was real. She always leaned more on the theory that it was her former partner who, with the help of his family, abducted Therese and took her to live with them in their home country of Pakistan. Over the years, there's been many cases of one parent kidnapping their own child due to disputes with a partner, only for them to take them out of the country, leaving the other parent with little opportunity to see their kid again. Whether that is truly what happened to Therese Johannessen may never be known. But while no bodily remains exist, it's fair to say there are many people that hope Therese will one day reappear and tell everyone in her own words what really happened that summer in 1988. Therese's younger sister, Tine, never actually met her older sibling. Still, when she turned 13, she decided to take the name Therese as her middle name. When she was a child, she didn't want to be the sister of the girl who disappeared. She just wanted to be a kid. But over the years that passed, she would learn to accept the story as part of her life. In her own words, her mom is the best mom in the world. She has displayed a resolve that she could only dream of having herself. And after Tina has made her own family, she appreciates even more what Inger-Lise has had to endure for over 3 decades. Today, Inger-Lise Johannessen lives in a small town called Geithus, and she has 4 grandchildren. But the small family still has to live with the past. They decline to take part in interviews anymore, but they remain hopeful that someone out there will one day offer new information that may offer them some sort of closure as to Therese's fate. This story is painful on so many levels. A book published last year has established there is only a 10-minute gap during which Therese's whereabouts are unaccounted for before her mother started to look for her. That means, in the same amount of time it takes to boil an egg, the ultimate tragedy befell a young girl who had her entire life ahead of her. The author of this book had a picture produced of Therese that envisioned what she could have looked like when she would have celebrated her 45th birthday on January 15th of 2024. And when you imagine this woman with long dark hair living an ordinary life in a Norwegian suburb, it's honestly heartbreaking. Sture Bergwall is now 75 years old, and he is free. But this is finally where his story departs from the story of Therese. Most of the crimes he confessed to over the years are not actively being pursued due to being considered expired, and only time will tell if any of the murders he admitted to will ever be solved. This is it for today's story. If you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. Like I mentioned earlier, I hope to make it to at least 500 subscribers by the end of the summer, and your support means a lot to me. Meanwhile, I will be back in 2 weeks with another case. Thank you for watching.